in the middle of the Australian Outback. There's no rider, no footprints, just a scattering of camping gear baking in the sun, left behind in a place where no one should have been. It was the start of one of the most bizarre disappearances the Outback had ever seen. Police were baffled. Who walks into the great sandy desert, one of the most brutal, unforgiving landscapes on Earth, with no support and barely enough water? Authorities launched a massive search. Then they called it off. But 6 weeks later, a news helicopter spotted something impossible. A lone man still walking, still alive. And why he went out there and how he survived remains one of the strangest stories to ever come out of the Australian wilderness. This is the story of Robert Bogucki. Robert Bogucki was a 33-year-old firefighter and part-time paramedic from Alaska. He wasn't just some guy with a backpack and a dream. He'd actually cycled across parts of India and logged thousands of kilometers solo and had a habit of pushing his limits. But this time he was chasing something different. In 1988, he flew into Sydney with his girlfriend Janet. They planned to ride their bikes together around Australia. But a few months in, Janet flew back home to Texas. Robert wanted to cycle a lot further than she did, so he kept going and she went home. And somewhere along the way, his goal shifted. On July 4th, 1999, he called Janet and told her about his new plan. He was going to cross the Great Sandy Desert by himself and on his bike. Janet didn't really love that idea, but they went over the maps together and they talked about the risks, and she felt comfortable enough after that. And he promised to call her once he reached Fitzroy Crossing by August 22nd. That was a tiny town about 700 kilometers away. Before he left, he mailed a postcard to his parents in Malibu outlining his route, and then he went silent. It would be the last time anyone heard from him for 6 weeks. His parents looked at a map of where their son was going and they thought, what the hell is he doing out there? The region was so remote, and one of them later said it's so far outback, it isn't even outback. They were worried. But they also knew Robert, and if anyone could walk into the wild and make it out again, it was him. On July 11th, Robert set out from Sandfire Roadhouse. Basically, it's the last speck of civilization before you hit pure desert. And Sandfire isn't much. There's a few fuel pumps, basic accommodations, a dusty yard, and the occasional wandering peacock. It's where tourists top up before the long haul north to Broome. It's remote, hot, and it feels like the end of the world, which for Robert was exactly the point. He was entering the Great Sandy Desert. Red dune fields, sparse vegetation, scorched earth, and almost no water. It's the second largest desert in Australia, covering 285,000 square kilometers in northwestern Western Australia. In summer, daytime temperatures soar above 40 degrees Celsius regularly, and there's basically zero humidity. And even their winter days can hit 30 degrees Celsius, which makes me laugh because that is a very hot summer day here in the Yukon. But to have that as a winter temperature just blows my mind. But that's Australia for you. It's a land dominated by the painfully sharp spinifex grass, and that's really sharp grass that slices at your legs and it grows in this thick clumps. The wildlife concentrate around the rare lakes and wetlands. There's more than 150 bird species, dozens of reptiles and mammals, and you rarely see them. And you definitely don't see people. There's no trails unless you count camel tracks. Robert carried a tarp, tent, compass, and some maps. He also had a bit of food and water, but not nearly enough of either. And he also had something else, a Bible, and a strange sense of peace about what he was doing. It was almost like a vision quest that he was on, a way to seek clarity through solitude. So he pedaled about 30 kilometers north and then turned east onto a rough dirt path called the Pegasus Track. It's not really a road, but more of a faint, windy path that cuts through the heart of the desert with zero services and zero signage. 2 days later, the bike was useless. The sand was just too soft to ride in. So he stashed the bike behind a tree and packed what he could carry and kept walking. And Robert felt free. He was emotional, and it felt like he was finally doing what he needed to do for years. On July 26, 15 days after Robert vanished, a tourist driving along the Pegasus tracks spotted something strange. A blue bicycle leaning against a shrub, and there was just this odd scattering of camping gear nearby. They didn't see any footprints or tire marks. It just looked like it was abandoned and the person disappeared into thin air. The location was 34 kilometers from the Great Northern Highway. deep in the sand dunes where traffic was rare and survival even rarer. So the driver contacted police in Broome. They were a bit concerned, and when officers arrived to collect the gear, they found a receipt tucked into the lining of a jacket, and it was signed by Robert Bogucki of Fairbanks, Alaska. And that's when the puzzle started coming together. Police reached out to the U.S. Embassy, and soon Robert's family and girlfriend Janet were contacted. When Janet heard that his bike had been abandoned, she wasn't surprised. She said Robert probably ditched it on purpose, that the sand would have made cycling impossible, and he was likely still out there walking. And she was right. By the time Aboriginal trackers were brought in, Robert already had a 100-kilometer head start, and he was still moving. Search and Rescue launched a grid search, and trackers fanned out on foot, reading the ground through the spinifex and the dust. But in the desert, footprints vanished quickly, and no one realized just how far ahead Robert was. To search crews, he could have been just over the next sand dune, or already dead. Because how could anyone, especially a foreigner, survive in such a harsh country? Meanwhile, Robert was nearly 200 kilometers into the Pegasus track, and then he reached a junction and turned north. That way, more than 400 kilometers away, was Fitzroy Crossing, his destination. And he had no idea anyone was looking for him. So he kept walking, leaving behind the only clues that would eventually guide the hunt, and that was scattered gear and the occasional footprint. By this time, many thought that Robert perished in the desert, but he was very much alive and very much alone. 2 days into the Pegasus track, that's when Robert realized that the bike was useless. The sand was too soft and it bogged him down every few feet. He was frustrated, and with his attitude going downhill, he left that bike behind, and he packed what he could carry and just kept walking. He walked in the early mornings and late afternoons when the heat wasn't as brutal. Midday temperatures could melt the soles off a pair of boots. During those hours, he found whatever shade he could under dunes, behind shrubs, sometimes in shallow holes that he dug himself. He took off his shoes often to prevent blisters, and his feet got pretty tough, and his body started adapting to this just walking day after day in the desert. He climbed 2-story sand dunes, and in those first 2 weeks, he was averaging about 20 to 25 kilometers a day, and still believed that he'd reach Fitzroy Crossing. Food ran out quickly, and then he ran out of water. But Robert wasn't panicking. Most of us would be, but Robert wasn't. Not yet. Because he'd studied survival basics, and in a strange way, he trusted the desert. When he first stumbled across a patch of moist sand under a dune, it felt like a sign to him. He'd only been digging to make a place to sleep, and he didn't expect to find water. So he stayed up digging, and he found enough water that he could drink, and he had this old tuna can that he would dip into the water and drink from. From then on, digging became routine. Not every hole that he dug paid off, but now and then in dry creek beds and shady valleys, he found just enough water. It wasn't clean, but it was wet, and that was enough. For food, he sucked nectar from desert flowers, and it was sticky and sweet and swarming with bugs. They stung his lips and face, but he kept going. And that sugar gave him a little bit of a rush and energy. It was something. But as his body adapted to the edge of survival, something else shifted. He wasn't just surviving, he was thinking, reflecting, and slowing down in a way that he never had before. 3 weeks in, he found a ridge with a few shady hollows and stopped. For a full week, he later said that it was the most peaceful he'd ever felt. He said, "I just felt like that was the place I needed to be. I didn't have visions or anything like that, but I felt at peace, and that I was where I was supposed to be." Robert stayed there in silence for that whole week, fasting, because he didn't have any food. It's kind of an involuntary fast, and meditating. And he couldn't clarify exactly what he learned during that week of solitude, but he did say that, "I didn't know what to expect as far as spirituality when I went out there. Native Americans can go for food and water for 2 to 3 days, and I didn't have visions or anything like that. I can't say that I felt a presence or anything. I just felt that that was the place where I should be at that point in time, in peace." So Robert was definitely looking for something out there on this journey. Eventually, after that week, he packed up and moved on. He said the feeling he had when he was there just stuck with him. And later said, "I look at it more as a time that was due to happen. Something that was going to happen in my life, or otherwise I was not going to be able to continue to live on Earth." He said, "I'm not really fond of cities these days. I needed this in order to be able to deal with daily life on Earth, in a city. I probably would have died in the desert if that feeling of peace had not come to me." It's wild. It's strange to think about, but the thing that nearly killed him might be what kept him alive. So what do you think? Was Robert really seeking something deeper, a deeper meaning? Was he trying to overcome something, or was he just reckless? Robert's story kind of reminds me of someone else, Chris McCandless. Chris walked into the Alaskan wilderness just a few years before Robert's trek through the Australian Outback. And Chris was looking for freedom, clarity, and something beyond the noise of modern life as well. He didn't make it out, though. There was different terrain and different outcomes, but maybe the same question was at the heart of it. Why do some of us feel the need to disappear in order to find ourselves? Were they both seeking something spiritual, escaping something painful, or were they just wired differently than most people? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to hear what this brings up for you. So while Robert was camped on a dune, completely unaware that search teams were losing hope for him, his footprints had vanished north of the Pegasus track, and police flew planes over the area, sent ground teams in, fighting brutal terrain and battered vehicles, but they found nothing. Eventually, they called off the search. One officer said, "It's not our fault if some idiot wants to walk across a desert and doesn't want to be found." And so at this point, many thought that Robert was dead, lost somewhere between the Pegasus track and McClarty track, but a few still believed that he was alive. His friends back in Alaska were confident at first, but as days turned into weeks, even they started to give up hope. On August 10th, Janet flew to Western Australia. She needed to see it for herself, the place where Robert vanished. She traveled with a news crew, met with a respected Aboriginal elder, and crossed dunes into the same desert that some believe that had killed Robert. And she told police that Robert might actually be avoiding search teams, not out of fear, but out of purpose. That he was trying to test himself and was seeking spiritual enlightenment. In her 2-day visit, she admitted the purpose of her trip was not only to visit the land, but to say goodbye to Robert. She never completely gave up hope, but she knew that if Robert wanted to walk out alive, he would. Then she flew back to the US. On August 17th, Robert staggered through the desert. He was skeletal, sunburnt, and still walking. And this was when a whole new character entered the story, and that's Garrison St. Clair. American, ex-military with a cigar in his mouth non-stop. And he was known to his team as the gunslinger. The year before, Garrison founded a search and rescue company designed to help people in situations where local authorities didn't have the tools or manpower to conduct exhaustive searches. Earlier that year, one of his teams had located a missing hiker's body in Fiji. And Garrison said, "When we go overseas, we're almost always looking for a body." Given the description about the terrain and extensive search, what he had for equipment, there was every reason to presume that Robert was dead. But Robert's parents weren't ready to believe that. When Robert was 19, he cycled alone through India for thousands of kilometers, sleeping under the stars with nothing but grit and willpower. His father said simply, "You don't give up in situations like this." So they brought in the big guns, literally. With the help of the U.S. State Department, Robert's family requested support from the 1st Special Response Group, and their mission was to bring home Robert, dead or alive. And Garrison didn't come alone. He brought 8 searchers, 3 trained scent dogs, and a full media circus. Australian authorities were wary. They weren't convinced that these Americans could handle the brutal conditions of the Great Sandy Desert, and there wasn't much time for them to brief with them before they started searching. When Garrison's team landed in Sydney, they were greeted by a wall of reporters. National news networks had suddenly taken interest, and there was no doubt who they were there to see: the bald, cigar-chomping, spotlight-loving American known as the Gunslinger. Can't get enough of that name, the Gunslinger. Garrison also brought in specialist Joel Harden, one of the top trackers in the U.S. He was a man who tracked over 5,000 people, from murderers to missing hikers to runaway kids. Harden met with Janet first. He needed to understand why Robert had gone into the desert. What kind of man was he, and what was he thinking? Joel said that there's no reason to believe he's not alive. But how the hell do I find him? And that's when Janet told him something surprising, saying that Robert might not want to be found, and that she believed he was on a spiritual quest, an intensely personal mission. He had taken his Bible with him on every leg of his journey through Australia, and he believed that this walk was about something bigger. Janet told him that either Robert would find God or God would find him, and his body would be left in the desert. To Robert's parents, that made sense. His dad said he's always had a desire to achieve an understanding of himself and find peace with God. By the time the American search team landed in Broome, Robert had been walking through the desert for 37 days. Joel and his crew gathered with local police and pored over maps, trying to guess where Robert might have gone. Joel and another searcher flew to the spot where the first search ended, and within 5 hours they found tracks. Joel crouched over them, and he knew that they were at least 3 weeks old. They followed them for about 16 kilometers, but who knew where Robert could be by now? And was he even still alive? The rest of the team drove in a convoy to an airstrip that would serve as a base camp. With them was a small media crew, including journalist Ben Martin. And it was Ben who spotted something incredible, a dusty set of bare footprints in the road. He said it was a stroke of luck. We could have turned off anywhere else and not even seen them. Joel came and examined the footprints and said that they were only 3 days old. From the tracks, he could see Robert's pattern: walk 20 minutes and rest 10, which is pretty amazing that he can figure that out. I go outside and I see tracks that have been there for days and think, ooh, new tracks? And then I remember, no, I saw those days ago. And Joel even saw a spot where Robert had taken a pee, a hopeful sign in such a dry environment. And he could tell a lot more from the tracks. He said you could see that by the strength of the footfall that he was in good shape and purposeful in his travel. So Robert was alive. But then the trail vanished again. 2 days lost. The dogs couldn't pick up the scent again. And by this time, the team was exhausted. And there was even talk of abandoning the search. But then on August 21st, a news helicopter flying above the ground team spotted something in the sand. Wrapped in a blue tarp tucked beneath a small shrub were Robert's belongings. His Bible, his notebook, an empty water bottle, sunscreen, a sleeping bag, and an ID card with his name on it. That area had already been searched, but the tarp had been missed. But this time there was no mistaking it. It felt ominous. Joel said at this point he leaves his Bible. Something definite and significant has changed. Meanwhile, Robert was fading. He'd now been alone in the desert for 6 long weeks. His water was almost gone, so he had to ration what little he had left, just enough to keep his mouth from going dry. And that lasted a week. And then that water ran out. And he says he walked for another week without water. But he was still able to walk. He was barefoot, starving, and starting to go a bit crazy, but he was somehow still alive. Joel pushed his team north, crossing lava rock and dry creek beds, and they found another of Robert's makeshift shelters. It was just a little depression in the sand, a hole where he'd spent the night. Joel could tell that Robert was exhausted and resting a lot now. He estimated that Robert was now only 12 hours ahead of them, but a thought haunted him, and that was Janet saying that if Robert thought he wasn't going to make it, he might try to hide his body so it wouldn't be found or disturbed. They kept searching, though, and then came a break, a set of footprints matching Robert's sandals. They followed the trail into a creek bed where they found the ashes of a small fire, and a message, with help spelled out in rocks, and an arrow pointing north. Moments later, Joel heard yelling. A news helicopter, which had been shadowing the search from above, had picked up someone moving through the scrub, and it was Robert. Joel and his search teams were less than an hour away from reaching Robert on foot. On August 22nd, after 43 days in the desert, a news helicopter spotted something unexpected: movement in a patch of waist-high grass near a muddy ravine, and it was Robert's. At first, Robert thought the helicopter was just a tourist flight, and he didn't even look up and try to wave to them. He said when they landed, they must have wondered what the heck I was doing, and then I realized they were there for me. Robert had walked over 400 kilometers or 250 miles in 43 days and hadn't seen a human in over a month. When the journalist approached, Robert's first words were, "How did you know my name?" He told them he was tired, hungry, but okay. In fact, he even offered them some of his murky, homemade eucalyptus tea. And then Robert said on camera, "Well, enough of this walking around." He said, "I came out and did what I wanted to do. I'm done."
Enough of this walking around.
You've had enough.
Yeah.
He said that he had gone 2 weeks without food and only just found water again. But in his words, he didn't think he was going to die. The site where he was found was just 15 kilometers from the Americans' base camp. And what happened next was messy. The TV crew, who was eager for an exclusive, kicked a photographer off the helicopter to make room for Robert. When the photographer argued about this, they handed him the helicopter's emergency beacon and told him to set it off if he got into trouble. And then they flew off with Robert on board. For nearly an hour, neither police nor the U.S. rescue team were notified that Robert had been found. The signal only came after a second helicopter, also media, spotted the stranded photographer in the middle of the bush and raised the alarm. Meanwhile, Robert was being filmed into the chopper, fed a banana, and promptly threw up. They actually had to land to let him puke. By the time the helicopter had dropped him off at Broome Airport, Robert had already given an interview wearing one of their branded t-shirts. The police and U.S. team were furious. One official said in their frantic desire to get the story, the news crew lost sight of their moral duty. They prioritized the scoop over the person. An executive producer tried to justify their behavior, saying that what red-blooded news team wouldn't conduct an interview in those circumstances? But authorities called it out for what it was, a dangerous, unethical stunt that was an insult to the people who risked their lives, and it was a risk to Robert's health because the U.S. team had a medical team close by that could have helped him right away and not fed him bananas. Robert lost 43 kilograms, around 66 pounds. His beard was tangled, his skin was scorched from the sun, but incredibly, he had no major organ damage, just dehydration and hunger. Doctors were stunned to see that. They expected to see someone with severe sunburn, kidney failure, and effects of exposure. But Robert only had a few scratches on his feet and back and some weight loss. He spent 2 weeks recovering in the hospital and ate everything in sight. Outside, the media frenzy exploded, though. Cameras were swarming the hospital, and headlines debated whether he was brave or foolish. And some accused him of staging it. Others called him a prophet. People couldn't decide if it was the next Into the Wild or a guy who just got in over his head. In the weeks after Robert's rescue, the world couldn't stop talking. Some hailed him as a spiritual seeker, others called him foolish, irresponsible, and even selfish. Police acknowledged his endurance, saying that he did a magnificent job coming up the Pegasus and McClarty tracks, but they also pointed out that he'd broken every rule of outback survival, with no extra water, no clear plan, and no radio. They said he basically did the opposite of what we tell people to do. But despite that, police chose not to pursue repayment for the $50,000 search. Robert, for his part, he insisted that he wasn't trying to hide from rescuers. He said he saw helicopters and he even waved at some of them, but nobody saw him. He actually felt awful about the trouble he caused, and he apologized to some of the searchers who were choked up just talking about finding him alive. His parents donated about $20,000 to the rescue team in gratitude, and one Aboriginal tracker later joked, "We had a lot of laughs over him. Like, really, why did you do this? Maybe go find God instead of dying in the desert." Even Robert laughed at it and said, "If I did it again, I'd take a shovel, a camel, and a GPS." He went 40 days without real food, and he says he went 12 days without water, which is, 9 days beyond the actual survival rate without water, so I'm kind of skeptical about that, but that's what he claimed. According to his brother-in-law, the experience changed Robert, and the whole ordeal brought peace to the family. And Robert admitted even he didn't fully understand why he went out there. He said, "Before I started out, I didn't know what I was looking for. Just a feeling that I had to do this." One of his firefighter friends in Alaska said, "The thing that struck me when I spoke to him was that he told me what a beautiful place it was, with the sun rising, the flowers, plants, and colors, that it was all magnificent. We think of it as very desolate, but he appreciated the beauty." By October, Robert was back at his parents' place and had regained almost all of his weight. He said, "I do feel satisfied. I scratched an itch, whatever it was that sent me out there in the first place." He said he felt alone in the desert, but he never really felt that he would die. He didn't feel desperate and was unaware that people were searching for him. He said, "I had the feeling of confidence that God would take care of me." And when asked about how he copes with stress now, he said, "I just try to live the way I did out there and find that sense of peace again." And the big question was, could Robert have made it out on his own? Joel Harden thinks that he could have. He said that Robert was ready to be found, but if he would have kept going, he would have made it to Fitzroy Crossing. But Garrison disagreed, saying that Robert made some wrong choices. And Ben, the journalist, agrees also with Garrison and said that Robert was just 2 miles away from a swarm of crocodiles and 100 more miles to civilization. Robert says that he was never lost, just a little off course. The worst stretch that he said was 3 days before he was found, when he'd run out of water, could barely walk a mile in a day, and that's when he wrote The Help with the Rocks. But even then, he forced himself to move and found one pool and then another, so he was able to keep drinking. He did plan to write a book about the whole ordeal, but never did because I couldn't find it anywhere. Eventually, Robert returned to Alaska and faded from the spotlight. No book deal, no speaking tour, just quiet life. And for the first time in a long time, he found peace in regular life. Some people run from the world, but Robert walked into the wilderness, and it gave him the clarity he couldn't find anywhere else. So that's the story of Robert Bogucki. And I'm just really blown away by the similarities between his and Chris McCandless's story. I'm thinking of diving into that one. I don't know if I want to yet, but let me know if you want me to cover it. It's one that's been done a lot, but I think diving into, the reasons why Chris went out there and did that are more important than what actually happened to him. So let me know what you think and I will possibly cover it. So if you love these stories as much as I do and you want to support the channel, you can do it in a few ways. You can become a member and unlock behind-the-scenes chaos like the time last week when a gopher met its end in my car engine and I had to dig out body parts. Or you can see me roaming the woods with my furry sidekicks or doing some of the work I'm doing around here. And some adventures, going to be going kayaking and hiking soon. Or you can grab some adventure merch from the shop and confuse strangers at the grocery store with our inside jokes on the merch. So I'll see you next time.